and this last session is going to be comparative. We have been talking so far mostly about democratic backsliding and resistance in Latin America, but we're going to take advantage of the knowledge, the institutional knowledge, and the great colleagues that we have at the University of Florida. So we have with us the director of the Center of African Studies, Larmer. He is an historian, and he just joined the University of Florida in August. So welcome, Miles, and it's great that he's going to present a paper on populism and democracy in Africa. Then we also have with us Sharon Austin. She's going to talk about the battle to preserve academic freedom in Florida and the nation. It's very important to bring these conversations back to home. So the idea that the United States was immune from populism or that there was an American exceptionalism is gone. So it's important that we bring these conversations to the US and Florida. And then we have Lenka Buštíková. She's the director of the Center for European Studies. She's a political scientist who works on authoritarianism and populism. And she just joined in the university not too long ago. So it's also great to have her here and that she's joining us. And then we also have Michael Bernhard, who's a comparative political scientist, was the editor of Perspectives on Politics. And I and Amy Kreppel are co-editing a book on Still the Age of Populism. And Michael is going to present the conclusions that he and I wrote. So please, speakers, you have 20 minutes. Of course, Michael, you can have 2 hours because our conclusions are so brilliant. You can be like Chavez. You can start to talk and you will never know when you finish. So thanks to all of you, and I will be trying to keep track of time.
Thank you, Carlos, for the invitation. And as you will see, I'm a historian cosplaying as a political scientist in places here. But I'm going to give you a sort of very somewhat crude overview of themes in populism. And I wanted to just briefly start with historicizing this because that's what we do. Peter Ecke, To Public's Approach, seminal in our understanding of African politics, paraphrasing the politics of the crowd, the street, the marketplace, the vernacular, as where African politicians connected to the people. And on the other hand, governance, the politics of parliaments, legislation in European languages. African nationalists were successful when they combined both sides of this coin, sufficiently charismatic to connect to mass discontent and aspiration, sufficiently institutionalized to administer the levers of power in the early post-independence period. We can see this in dress, the educated anti-colonial elites of the 30s and 40s who wore suits, expressing themselves in moderate reformist language, lost out to younger radical nationalists who, while educated often in the West, understood popular slogans and Africanist attire. So here is the tension between technocratic state administration and post-colonial political transformation of elements of what we can call populism. Centralized post-colonial states in the late 60s and early 70s saw a further centralization of power in the hands of the presidency, regardless of left-right affiliations. The ineffectiveness of largely inherited state institutions, expanded for development purposes, led to highly personalized rule in many cases. And we see leaders drawing on an implicit or explicit Afrocentric discourse, rejecting Western institutions such as multi-party democracy, cloaking themselves in neo-traditional chieftaincy. And when frustrated with limits placed on their authority by technocrats at home or donors abroad, commonly reaching out to the people in speeches or tours of rural areas where they received popular acclaim. A message that often involved a frustrated rejection of Eurocentric or neo-colonial institutions that I think can usefully be thought of as populist. And my favorite example here is Mobutu Sese Seko, long-term ruler of Congo Zaire, a Western-trained, CIA-backed military man who reinvented himself, picture at the bottom, as an aristocratic potentate, cloaked in the invented traditions of chiefly authority, deploying a discourse of authenticity, requiring citizens to adopt African names, requiring public officers to wear African dress. Mobutu in the archives is a tantalizing figure. In the IMF archives, we find IMF reports optimistically tying his ministers down to spending cuts and debt relief, only to be followed by an announcement in the Zairian media that Citoyen Mobutu, speaking to an impromptu crowd of workers, had unilaterally awarded a pay rise that alleviated their hardship and broke the terms of that agreement. Mobutu could operate in this way because of the West's dependence on him as a local general in the Cold War, but also, key theme in my work, because Zaire possessed globally strategic mineral wealth that, until the late 70s, provided a key political resource. Mineral wealth is important as a theme here because it accrued directly, more or less, to the central state and its leader, particularly following mine nationalization. And secondly, because political attacks on foreign-owned mine companies or Western mineral markets tapped into a widespread and influential, because significantly accurate, characterization of the nature of African economies' relationship to the global economy, trapped as providers of raw materials, agricultural or mineral. The causes of that we can debate, but crucially, I want to focus on its political utility. Even as a figure like Mobutu drained away state revenue to his Swiss bank account, he railed against the neo-colonial West for its criticism of his autocracy. The global decline in mineral prices from the late 70s until the early 2000s was followed by widespread indebtedness, economic liberalization, and a really meaningful popular democratic wave that, as elsewhere, swept Africa in the early 1990s. The following decade was the high point of technocracy, good governance, neoliberal economic policies, a hegemony of free market influence. African mines and other parts of the economy were privatized. Some state-owned mining companies paced back into the hands of Western corporations, others sold to new operators from India and China. Such companies divested themselves of the social wage provided to workers in earlier phases of their operations, housing and healthcare, and generally paid very low taxes or royalties. Multi-party democracy was often uneasily sutured onto highly centralized constitutions with civic freedoms highly restricted, and virtually nowhere did this brief era of good governance lead to or correlate with meaningful improvements in living standards. That changed in the early 2000s in terms of economic growth, not because these reforms worked, but because Chinese industrialization pushed up global mineral prices. The vast unheralded profits now made by foreign companies, providing little compensation to states or communities, provided a platform for a new generation of African populists, resource nationalists, whose attacks on unaccountable foreign investors resonated particularly with younger people whose negative experience of economic stagnation made them nostalgic for the ostensible achievements of first-generation nationalists. And I can speak in questions more generally about this populist generation, John Magufuli in Tanzania, Jacob Zuma and Julius Malema in South Africa. In various ways, they rejected Western good governance, challenged liberal values, characterized themselves crucially as true African patriarchs, culturally, socially, and sexually. Other older leaders such as Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, donned this popular garb to undermine democracy and attack variously feminism and LGBTQ rights as Western impositions. For the rest of the paper, I want to touch on, I hope, the revealing case of Zambia, like the DR Congo, highly dependent on mineral production, particularly copper and cobalt. And there we see this exponential rise in mineral prices in the early to mid 2000s. Political pressure, as a consequence, grew on the private owners of Zambian mines to direct a greater proportion of their earnings to the country. And these demands fueled the rise of Michael Satta's Patriotic Front Party, propelled to government in 2011 through populist attacks on foreign investors. I first wrote about Satta in 2007, and Alistair Fraser and I then characterized him as a sort of classic populist. His 2006 manifesto briefly stated, the main beneficiaries of the current regime are relatives, friends, and foreigners. Its leaders have no conscience. They have not been moved by the plight and suffering of Zambian workers, reduced to daily casual employees, while foreign firms feast on their sweat and diminishing natural resources. And we describe Satta's transgressive campaigning style. He labeled the incumbent president a cabbage following his injuries in a car accident, and at party rallies, his followers kicked cabbages around the stage. It's a highly transgressive political approach. A key element of the transmission of PF messaging were the various mine workers' unions, powerful in the globally strategic mineral industry in the Copperbelt province. Mine union officials, although weakened from their one-party state era, remained an important interface between national politicians and mine-based companies. But in power, Satter did little to convert this rhetorical criticism into decisive policy changes. So this mineral wealth remained sort of unrealized for popular aims. In 2013, Zambia exported more than $6 billion worth of copper. Only $200 million was paid in income tax by the entire sector. Satter's death in office in 2014, the elevation to the presidency of the party's new leader, Edgar Lungu, led to a more assertive resource nationalism. And in a longer paper co-authored with Zambian anthropologist Dr. James Musonda, published last year, we take the readers through a growing popular criticism of two of the country's leading mine companies, KCM, owned by the Indian company Vedanta, MCM, owned by Swiss mining giant Glencore. The criticisms that were made of these companies in popular discourse were failure to pay minimum wages, failing to make redundancy payments, and then growing sense that these companies were extracting resources even beyond their contracts from the country, loading companies with debt, stalling operations. And in May 2019, Lungu announced the liquidation of KCM's license to operate, officially because of alleged environmental and financial breaches, a liquidation widely heralded and supported by unions in the mining sector, a decision highly popular in the Copperbelt region where the mines are located, but widely condemned in international business circles. Attempts to attract a new investor then became the subject of legal action. MCM, owned by Glencore, was singled out for criticism for its transfer pricing policies, denying Zambians the rightful benefits of its operations. And in the April 2020, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, MCM placed its two mines into care and maintenance operations, halting production. The company unilaterally terminated 5,000 jobs, and the labor movement took to the streets, expressing community anger at this decision. Mine unions organized hundreds of mine workers, marketeers, politicians, small-scale marketers to march to the offices to protest these decisions. And the union leadership called on the Zambian president to use the same powers to liquidate KCM to take MCM under control. Numau Union President James Chancer told the Minister of Mines, quote, "If you want our vote again, you must speak on our behalf and do something. Our demand is that they rescind their decision and go back where they came from." And days after these protests, the government announced the revocation of Glencore's license, seen as a nationalization. And both in timing and specific way it was carried out, it's really only explicable in terms of PF's attempts to secure the strategic Copperbelt electorate via this resource nationalist message. We observed in August 2021 a presidential election campaign where the union president Chewe declared, "Mr. President, we have been paid our benefits as you promised, we will give you our vote." So an endorsement from the union leadership. But nonetheless, despite that endorsement, uncertainty surrounded these takeovers. MCM's the negotiation over these takeovers taken place in secret, announced publicly in January 21, involved the purchase of one company, MCM, at a nominal price of $1 and taking on by the state-owned company of a new debt of $1.5 billion. Zambia had only 2 months earlier become the first African country in some years to default on its international debt. So Zambia, the state, absorbed all the resultant risk and burden of mineral production. And one interviewee to us assessed the agreement thus: "This is a dead deal meant to keep miners temporarily employed at the expense of the company for which they work, at least until the election." So this, for the government, was a very clear use of a kind of populist resource nationalism to seek the support of a very strategic and influential group, the labor unions, the organized mine workers, occupying a very important political position at the center of Zambia's political economy. This is the cosplaying of Pol Sci here. I have some figures. You do not need to read them in detail, but what happened was the victory, much unanticipated victory of Hakainde Hichilema's technocratic, market-oriented UPND party, achieved in part by securing a majority of the electorate in the country's most populated urban areas for the first time, the capital, Lusaka, and this Copperbelt region where PF's resource nationalism had hitherto guaranteed its support over the previous decade. What we see here is nationally a significant swing of votes away from PF and towards Hakainde Hichilema, the technocratic figure, but very clearly in these figures, both in Copperbelt province and in a number of constituencies which are dominated by mining and by these mine companies, the most substantial swing. Now, these are locations where the operations of these two companies operated. These are communities historically closely involved in the mobilization of mine labor and opposition movements from the colonial period to the present day. Epicenters of local resource nationalism directed against these companies' operations, PF's pre-election campaigning, focusing on these constituencies with its resource nationalism and messaging. And these constituencies saw amongst the largest swings in the entire country away from the Populist Party, PF, towards the technocrat Hichilema. So not only were resource nationalist policies ineffective in securing votes for the incumbent party, they contributed to or correlated with among the most dramatic swings against the Lungu presidency anywhere in Zambia. Now, part of the wider context here is a widespread popular movement against PF, seen as authoritarian in its populism, seen as undermining democracy, mobilizing ethnically based youth brigades, and UPND, the opposition party, had the wider support of civil society, independent media, Western governments, and there was a very impressive movement led by local civil society, particularly women's organizations, campaigning against mobilizing youth to vote against PF. But nonetheless, this, I think, played an important part in this strategic area. And we've carried out interviews with mine workers, with organized union officials, and some of what they told us is here. What I think you can see here is a rejection by local Copperbelt communities of resource nationalism, as we would say, from above, opportunistic, not well-designed, secretive, designed to ensure that their expressed concerns about investment and employment creation were expressed in rhetorical terms, but communities well positioned to see the flaws in these processes. So while the government focused on ever more micro-populist measures narrowly directed at these communities, these workers and their wider Copperbelt community and the civic society they were linked to observed with growing alarm, the decline of their strategic industry, which had, if anything, accelerated following these takeovers. And the interview that we have in front of you, I think, hopefully summarized some of this. Interviews and respondents counterposed the legal formal nationalization of MCM to their vision of a nationalization that they believed was practical, that could ensure the investment needed to ensure the mine would run effectively and equitably, and ensure that Zambians would be its primary beneficiaries, both as a process and in the subsequent operation of the state-owned mine. Which is in a way an optimistic story, quite at odds with much of what we've heard today and yesterday. I would argue that this mobilization, both in the Copperbelt area and in civil society, demonstrates a possibility to go beyond a narrow binary between rhetorical, authoritarian populism and a technocratic good governance neoliberal agenda, which for Zambians and for many Africans has over the last 30 years resulted in precisely no meaningful increase or improvement in their living standards. Zambians value democracy, but they value democracy because they believe it may lead to improvements in their social and economic living standards, not for itself. However, the more pessimistic version of this is that this led to the election of a technocratic, neoliberal, good governance party, which is in the process of negotiating debt relief via swinging public sector cuts and reprivatizing these mines in the interest of the corporations. So while we can see the opportunity, the party system here remains divided between technocratic good governance on the one hand and the potential for authoritarian populism to return. Some brief conclusions. Unsurprisingly, but strikingly, resource nationalism in Zambia, as in many other places, populism has proven very successful in opposition campaigning and reasonably disastrous as a technique of governance. It also proved ineffective here in securing urban votes for a ruling party. But international mining companies remain widely unpopular, and it would be unsurprising if a more effective version of resource nationalism was to return and find resonance with this community. Two very speculative points that I wanted to flag up more broadly here. One is to do with the more general decline in liberal democracy, particularly in Sahelian West Africa, where we see a rise of military regimes. And I think we might detect something that we might call a military populism here. The image at the top is in Burkina Faso. We see the Burkina Faso flag next to the Russian flag on a mobilized demonstration, but nonetheless a demonstration that resonates in many ways with many West Africans, decrying French imperialism, neo-imperialism, and military influence, and welcoming the intervention of Russian military forces alongside the Burkinabe military, which took control relatively recently. So there is a version of military populism that I think also resonates in parts with African history, that of Mobutu, Thomas Sankara, a previous ruler of Burkina Faso. And then the final, even more speculative point that relates to resource nationalism here is the impact of green minerals or strategic minerals or critical minerals, as they're sometimes discussed. The expanding production in Africa of cobalt and lithium, the bottom is a lithium mine, crucial to the clean energy, EV, climate change agenda of the West, and in theory in the international community, and the extent African governments already beginning to ask questions about the extent to which this green minerals, clean energy revolution will be an expansion of dirty, polluting, exploitative mineral production in the global South and in Africa in particular. And I would not be surprised, but I am certainly speculating that that might be the next iteration of African resource nationalist populism. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for inviting me to come out today. My presentation is probably going to be a little bit different from some of the others that you've heard yesterday and today. I want to focus on the assault on democracy in the United States by focusing on the battle for academic freedom here in our state of Florida and also in other places in the United States. So that's what my presentation will be about. So this tells you a little bit about me. I'm originally from Memphis. I've been here at UF since 2001. I teach courses in political science and African-American studies. I specialize in African-American politics, and this tells you a little bit about the two books. I'm on sabbatical this year. I've been doing a lot of traveling, promoting the two books that I just co-edited last year. And I'm currently working on the beginning stages of a manuscript on the politics of academic freedom. So a lot of the information that I talk about today will be information that I'm planning to include in my book manuscript. So today I'll be talking about the assault on democracy and the battle for academic freedom, basically with a focus on universities. And my argument in my book is that the battle that we're now seeing and the things that I'll be talking about today, the different pieces of legislation that are being introduced and passed in various states, are a backlash against the 2020 racial justice campaigns, especially the different international racial justice campaigns that occurred after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020. And so you already had seen some evidence of different states and different legislators introducing legislation to curtail academic freedom, but I argue that it increased after 2020 and after the emphasis on racial justice, especially on college campuses. And so today I'll be talking about some examples of some of the state laws that have been introduced and that have been passed that have restricted speech, especially the teaching of critical race theory or CRT in public schools and at universities as well. and specifically focus on the legislation here in Florida that has been introduced last year and just recently here in our state, and also talk a little bit about something that happened at New College of Florida, if you're familiar with what happened there in Sarasota, and there was a takeover, how that is becoming, I guess, a model for the nation, and we shouldn't be surprised to see similar things happening at other, especially other smaller private colleges. So in 2020, so when I say that the things that we're seeing now are an example of the backlash that occurred as a result of things that happened in 2020. So as you know, 2020 was when many of us had never heard of COVID before. The first COVID case was confirmed, and that led to an international shutdown in the United States and other countries as well, an international pandemic. And also a lot of drama with Donald Trump, which I don't need to go into. He was acquitted of impeachment, and so that, you know, I don't have to talk about that. Donald Trump is always involved in some kind of drama. But anyway, I want to focus mostly on what happened in May of 2020. George Floyd, as many of you know, was an African-American man, and some people, onlookers, watched and videotaped it as an officer whose name was Derek Chauvin held his knee on his neck for almost 9 minutes, and Mr. Floyd later died. And so that was something that really caused a lot of horror all across the world as people watched this. And this also had racial implications because Mr. Chauvin is white, Mr. Floyd was black, and people, onlookers, stood by and watched and tried to get him to stop doing this. Other police officers stood by and calmly watched as basically he killed this man. And so eventually Mr. Floyd died, and that caused a lot of outrage in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime, in the sense that there had been other racialized crimes before, but there was something about this particular crime because it was caught on tape, because I think in the age of social media, it's so easy for things to go viral. And so as a result of that, people were really outraged. And as a result, on a lot of college campuses, including on this one, and in a lot of different, not just on campuses, but in a lot of different places, a lot of different venues, eventually people started talking more about racial justice. And so people who had never really talked about race before wanted to learn more about how something like this could happen. And so as a result of that, you saw a lot of people coming up with different innovative types of courses, talking about things like critical race theories and other racial theories in their classes. And so that led to, I think, a backlash in the sense that a lot of legislators were never really comfortable with this. And as a result of the increased focus on race and discussions of racism, they decided to do something to sort of curtail that. But the problem with that is the way that they're doing it. And so that is leading to an assault on academic freedom and also a larger assault on democracy. And then also in 2020, as you know, Joe Biden was eventually declared the winner of the year's presidential election. Okay, so critical race theory is something that a lot of these state laws, many of them are banning it and saying that you can't talk about this particular theory. This is a video. I don't have time to show it to you, but if you'd like to get this presentation, I can send it to you. That kind of describes what critical race theory is. But I guess that leads to the question of why is it so controversial? It basically says that racism is institutional or is systemic, and it's not based on individual acts or individual prejudice, but it's based on institutional and systemic prejudice and institutional and systemic racism. So in other words, in America and in other places as well, racism isn't something that's just practiced by individuals in an isolated type of situation. It's something that institutions is ingrained in our society. And so this tells you a little bit about its development during the late 70s and later into the early 1980s. And a lot of studies use critical race theory as a framework to, I guess, discuss and to describe race and racism in American society and also in other societies. So that leads again to the question, why is it being banned? Why is it that some people who are introducing legislation are specifically focusing on that particular theory, CRT, and saying that professors should not teach it at colleges and that teachers should not use it in their classes? And they argue, beginning in 2020, Christopher Rufo, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, he was the person who found, according to his research, that critical race theory had infiltrated government and also classrooms. And so he was arguing that because more people were talking about race and using critical race theory as a framework, that they were basically forcing people to think a certain type of way. And so he launched a campaign. He worked with President Trump, and President Trump, he encouraged him to issue Executive Order 13950, which prohibited trainings on systemic racism and sexism because they're divisive. And so you see a lot of that language, divisive concepts, in a lot of the laws that have been passed in various states because of the belief that educators are basically infiltrating their classrooms, are forcing students to think that America is a horrible place, it's a bad place, America's racist, America was founded on institutional racism, and that institutional racism still exists, still disadvantages certain people, and that's considered to be divisive according to this executive order. And that is the type of, I guess, teaching and type of instruction that's now being banned. So since 2021, and the numbers probably even have gone up, but since January of 2021, 44 states have either introduced bills or taken some other step that will restrict the teaching of critical race theory, or not only that theory, but other theories as well that examine race, or in some way try to curtail the way that teachers discuss racism and sexism as well. So there have been bans in K through 12 schools because of the idea that teachers are using this theory and using their teachings on race to sort of indoctrinate children in grades K through 12 to think a certain way, to be anti-American, to have these views that America is a horrible place, America is a racist, sexist, homophobic type of place. And so those are the types of things that are now being banned. So teachers are being asked to change their course offerings. Sometimes courses are being eliminated altogether. Teachers are being asked to remove certain things from their syllabi. Books are being banned in a lot of libraries throughout the country, and probably it's happening in other countries as well. So these are just these are the states that have introduced at least legislation. And that doesn't mean that this legislation has passed, but they at least have introduced legislation, including Florida. But as you can see, this is pretty widespread. These are places where they have introduced legislation specifically to ban the teaching and the discussion of critical race theory. So you can see just how widespread this is. And you can also see that these are states from all over the country. It's not just in any particular region. So these are just some of the examples, and you see similar types of language in these laws. This is an example from last year in Arizona, when the governor vetoed a bill that would have prevented schools, in this case K through 12 schools, from teaching that any racial or ethnic group is inherently superior, or that individuals are racist because of their race and other related concepts. So that gives you an idea. And so it was found in this case that this was a law that was found to be unenforceable, but nevertheless, this gives you an example of one that was introduced there. Also in Arkansas, on her first day in office, Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders in January 23 signed an executive order prohibiting teachers from saying that any group is inherently superior or inferior to another. And so the purpose of that is to prevent or to promote or to prevent teachers from practicing indoctrination or from talking about critical race theory. And then also something similar in the state of Georgia, April 2022, Governor Brian Kemp signed a law which would prohibit schools from teaching any divisive concepts. And you see similar language in a lot of these. For example, concepts that say that one race is inherently superior to another race, or that the United States of America is fundamentally racist. So you see similar types of language, and the language of divisive concepts oftentimes is in many of these. And then also, again, I won't go through all of these, but Kentucky, Missouri, similar types of things, discriminatory concepts, divisive concepts. Many of them specifically mention critical race theory and other theories as well. Many of them, also some of them have introduced things like the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Books are being banned in many of these pieces of legislation. Even places like New York, which is thought of as sort of a similar, as sort of a liberal type of place, even there was a bill even that was introduced there that would ban the teaching of critical race theory, or the study of the 1619 Project that failed to pass, but nevertheless was introduced even in a blue state, a liberal state like New York. So something similar in Virginia. So that turns to the focus on Florida. And some of these are pieces of legislation. If you live in Florida, you probably are somewhat familiar with some of these. HB 233 in 2001, and it included the language. It was designed to protect the expression of diverse viewpoints. And so really that sounds good, because you want to make sure, if you're an educator, especially at the university level, that you want people with all types of ideological viewpoints, whether they be liberal or conservative, to be able to speak. And so, but I think it ended up being pretty controversial in the sense that students were allowed to fill out surveys every year in which they would be asked about whether or not there was enough intellectual freedom and viewpoint diversity on their campuses. So they were basically asked, you know, in other words, are your professors allowing you to speak freely? Are your professors respecting your viewpoints? And I think that this is something that was directed more so to protect conservative students, many of whom believed that they didn't feel comfortable expressing their views in class, that there was not enough viewpoint diversity because of, I guess, the idea that at universities that professors tend to be more liberal, they tend to be more likely to reject conservative viewpoints. So this was pretty much the purpose of that. And this requirement didn't just apply to teaching and classroom instruction, but it also applied to faculty research. Again, faculty had to, I guess, express diverse viewpoints in their research, lectures, and their writings, and also in their public commentary. And if you notice in all of these, the language is, I guess, somewhat vague because you don't really know exactly what they mean by, if I'm being told basically that I'm supposed to include viewpoint diversity in my writings, what exactly does that mean? So I guess the language is pretty vague. And then even more so than that, students not only were allowed to fill out a survey, but they also could record video or audio of class lectures. So if you had a student, I guess, that objected and that felt that that person was the victim of the professor not accounting for viewpoint diversity, they could record that professor's lectures and could maybe tape it for their own personal use and could then use it, I guess, in a cause of action against that particular professor. So this was HB 233. So that really is something that, especially I would think to a lot of untenured professors and even for people who are tenured, but for untenured professors, it would be pretty intimidating because, you know, I mean, if you teach, as many of us do, every single person in this room who's ever taught a class, I'm sure has had difficult students, or students who didn't like the class, students who didn't like you, students who didn't like something that you said. And can you just imagine if they could like videotape you and then say, hey, this person gave me this grade because, I mean, you know, with this type of really vague language, it kind of would make you paranoid. It really would make you think that something really horrible could happen to a professor through no fault of that person's own. That person could just be teaching a class and may not even know that he or she said something or did something that was inappropriate and may not even know that he or she is guilty of breaking the law. So this was something that a lot of people were and still are really troubled by. HB 1, I guess I'll go through this one pretty quickly, in 2021, defines a riot in Florida. And this was, if you remember, after the murder of George Floyd, there were a lot of mass protests in a lot of cities. And a lot of people define these protests as riots because some of them did end up being kind of, I guess, violent. And so that this was designed so that this would not happen here in Florida. So it criminalized being at a protest. If you're, let's say, if there's a large gathering of people and there's a large protest and you're there, you can be accused of having participated in a riot. Even if you didn't necessarily do anything wrong, just by the sheer fact that you were there, you could be arrested and be accused of participating in a riot. It also granted, 5 minutes, granted immunity from civil liability for people who ran over protesters if the protester participated in this riot. So even if you were, I guess, the victim of an act of violence, if someone ran over you, I guess the argument or the rationale is that you shouldn't have been there because you were participating in a riot, and if someone ran over you, that person probably is pretty immune from any type of liability. So I want to talk a little bit about Florida's Stop Woke Act in 2022, because this is one that a lot of people are very familiar with. And it also was signed in April of 2022 to prohibit, again, same type of language as some of the other laws in other states, lessons or trainings that teach that individuals are inherently racist or sexist because of their race or sex. And also bans the teaching that people are privileged or oppressed because of their race or sex or other related concepts. So it's not saying that you can't talk about racism or sexism or any type of discrimination, but you can't really, I guess it's really kind of confusing as far as what it's saying, but you can't mention the critical race theory that is banned. You can't also mention the 1619 project, and you can't, I guess, quote unquote, indoctrinate students to think that certain people are racist. And I guess the idea behind this is the idea of teaching that, I guess, white people are racist because of the legacy of racism, or men are sexist because of the legacy of sexism. But again, the language is very vague and confusing. So Purnell versus Lamb was a lawsuit that was filed in August of 2022 to challenge the Stop Woke Act. And this tells you a little bit about this case. I'm one of the plaintiffs in this case, so I can't really talk very much about it. But we did manage to get a preliminary injunction in November of 2022 that blocked the state from enforcing HB 7. And so we argue that HB 7 is unconstitutional on First Amendment and also 14th Amendment grounds. And so you can pretty much read that on your own. And these are the plaintiffs, professors who teach courses that deal with some of the prohibited concepts. One of the student plaintiffs who now has graduated and no longer is a plaintiff was a senior at Florida State. And then the case is named after Professor Leroy Purnell, who's a professor of law at Florida A&M College of Law. And so in the time I have remaining, I just want to talk a little bit about New College of Florida in 2023 is also an example of an assault on democracy when basically the Board of Trustees were people who were replaced with people who support Governor DeSantis, including Christopher Rufo, whom I've already mentioned. The president was fired and also was replaced with someone who I guess has more of an affiliation with the governor. The DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office, and many of its programs were dismantled. And also the Gender Studies program, I just met someone from there a few weeks ago, and she said that they still offer courses, but there is an effort to end or to dismantle the Gender Studies program at New College. So there's been an ideological takeover, in other words, at New College. And then finally, SB 266 in 2023, just last year, it banned spending on any campus programs or activities in Florida that advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, out of the idea that these are programs that are basically just indoctrinating students to think a certain way, not really fulfilling the mission of bringing about diversity that they're supposed to. And so it's banning the spending on that or any political or social activism. That's not to say student, but some, I guess, political and social activist efforts are not, you can't use public spending on those efforts. It also bans or prohibits general education courses that are required at Florida universities that teach about identity politics or certain theories like critical race theory, intersectionality, that talks about the racism, sexism, classism that women of color experience, or systemic racism. And so basically it's causing changes in the curricula in a lot of state universities. And also even the last point is also very controversial. It empowers the governor's political appointees to engage in periodic post-tenure reviews of university faculty. So that's something that's gotten a lot of opposition and a lot of debate. So the last point is that I'll make, and then I'll end there. There's been a lot of activism throughout the state of Florida, and not just in Florida, but in other states as well, where these assaults on academic freedom and democracy are taking place. We have a very strong union. The United Faculty of Florida, the ACLU, and other civil rights groups have been very involved in challenging these pieces of legislation. There are different organizations, campus organizations, community organizations, and others. There have been banned book clubs that a lot of students in K through 12 have put together to sort of encourage the reading of books that are being banned. There are teach-ins and also there are voter registration campaigns. So I'll go ahead and just stop there because I think I'm out of time, and thank you all very much.
Move the arrows, right? Yeah. Hello, I would like to thank, first of all, I would like to thank Carlos for inviting me and for involving the Center for European Studies in this wonderful event. I know there are only 2 presentations between you and food, but almost there. And I will echo a lot what was said, but in the context of Central and Eastern Europe. I think by now it's obvious that somewhere on this planet there is a Dropbox or a drawer with a global playbook available to all who wish to restrict women's rights, human rights, and politicize LGBTQ issues. And in this brief presentation, I would like to draw your attention to the importance of socially conservative advocacy networks, civic groups that advocate for traditional family values, and their complicated role in advocating for policy change, liberal policy change and polarization in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. So I will briefly talk about the motivation, then I will introduce 4 civic groups or uncivic illiberal groups in the 4 countries, which is Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. I will drag you very quickly through public opinion views, and when you think it's over, I will briefly speak about 3 endorsement experiments that I did in these countries, and then I'll briefly conclude. So why would one want to study socially conservative groups? Because they meddle into domestic politics. So for example, in July 2022, a member of the Czech parliament, Marek Benda from the Christian Democratic Party, was one of the 5 MPs who put forward a proposal that would modify the Czech constitution for the purpose of defending marriage as a bond between a man and a woman. This amendment was unusual for 3 reasons. First, it went against majority preferences, as 70% of adults in Czechia support codification of marriage between gay and lesbian couples. Second, the proposal came from a niche politician linked to churches in a secular country where close to 70% declared in the 2021 census that they have no faith. So it's a country where most people believe in the benefit of antioxidants and reincarnation than Jesus. And third, and that is important, the proposed amendment verbatim copied passages from a civic association, Alliance for Family, known for its advocacy for traditional gender roles, opposition to same-sex marriage and abortions. The Alliance for Family is a group that emerged in 2017 as a volunteer parent network. But by 2021, the Alliance leadership was engaged in writing legal briefs for the Constitutional Court, deciding on the legality of foreign adoptions of same-sex couples. Czechia fades in comparison to Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. A sister organization in Slovakia is also called Alliance for Family. It was founded in 2013, so also relatively recently. Today, it is supported by more than 90 organizations, most in the non-profit sector of social care. It rose to prominence 1 year after it was established, when it collected over 100,000 signatures for a referendum on family that actually failed due to a lower turnout. Poland, this was mentioned already yesterday and today, is a home to Ordo Juris, a legal advocacy group fighting, in the words of Jerzy Kwaśniewski, against discrimination of people adhering to Christian values. A former Minister of Justice collaborated with Ordo Juris on legal matters, such as the process to begin Poland's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention. And I will actually speak about the role of Ordo Juris and Istanbul Convention non-adoption in Czech Republic this month. And so the Istanbul Convention, most of you probably know, is a convention that should prevent violence against women and domestic abuse. Ordo Juris president also was present at the annual meeting of conservative circle CPAC in Hungary in 2022. This was the first gathering, a CPAC conference in Europe that was not hosted by a Hungarian church or by Fidesz, but it was hosted by the Center for Fundamental Rights, a research organization that also aims to preserve Christian social traditions and its mission. And so all these groups are part of big, in more and more influential transnational conservative networks. So what is the relationship between religion and political illiberalism in Central Europe? Even although Central Europe or Eastern Europe is defined by an adherence to more traditional family roles, and Christianity is still an irrefutable cultural reference point, culture wars over family values have been mostly dormant during the first 2 decades after the fall of communism. Religion has been understudied as a driver of political outcomes, and the contestation of sexual autonomy has become a new frontier of identity politics. And so if you want to understand, so I have shown in some previous work and current work, if you want to understand why some of these policies have changed, you can do it using sort of the traditional approaches, either from the voter perspective or party perspective. But very often when you dig deeper, you will see that behind a lot of the policy changes are advocacy efforts of organizations and bottom-up civic groups. So family policies and the regulatory policies of reproduction have undergone unprecedented politicization of Central Eastern Europe, and these intermediate organizations play a big role in changing policies in these countries. Just to give you sort of a brief overview of these four countries. They're very similar and very different. Only in Hungary and Czech Republic, registered partnership is allowed. None of these countries allows for same-sex marriage. Abortion is legal in 3 countries with the exception of Poland. And actually, that doesn't mean that abortion in Hungary is easy, but it is still legal. And actually, Hungary has one of the highest abortion rates in Europe, and 78% of Hungarians support it. However, if you, for example, look at the red bubble, you see that in the past 10 or 20 years, there's a lot of movement in the policy domain. So, for example, there are new laws that now codify that gay and lesbian couples cannot adopt foreign children. So this is a gift from the Alliance for Family, and it's sort of a meddling in the legislative process. In Slovakia, in 2020, during COVID, abortion was almost prohibited because a head of the health committee, who is a Christian advocate, Anna Zaborska, smuggled it into the COVID legislation, but it didn't pass one vote. So again, almost a policy change, almost an abortion ban in a country due to civic activism of a Christian politician. And then if you, this was mentioned also, if you know anything about changes in reproductive rights in Poland and Hungary, churches and church advocacy groups play a big role in shaping sort of the policy agendas. Another remarkable thing about these organizations is that they are international. So for example, this is a picture from CPAC, which was in Hungary, organized by the Center for Fundamental Rights. And if you look at these 4 gentlemen, it's a director of Center for Fundamental Rights. Next to him is a president of Ordo Iuris, then Italian editor-in-chief for European conservatives. And the last person is a president of an Israeli think tank, Kohelet. And in the Czech Republic, just very recently, Ordo Iuris meddled into a Senate vote on the Istanbul Convention in the Czech Republic. So in Poland, Poland adopted Istanbul Convention against violence of women, and Ordo Iuris is very sad about that, but they basically, before the Senate voted and the vote failed by 2 votes, they engaged in a massive disinformation campaign, sent various emails to Czech senators, and sent them also a legal brief that advocated against the adoption of the Istanbul Convention, and 2 votes, and this failed. So this is absolutely unprecedented and remarkable success of meddling of another organizations into domestic politics of a neighboring country. Theoretically speaking, why would we want to study socially conservative groups? If you think about a lot of the literature about populism, far right, and backsliding, they usually focus on supply side and demand side explanations. It's usually either what voters want or what parties do. And so from a lot of the literature, intermediate organizations and ancillary groups are missing. And of course, there is some literature, for example, group again around Gattinara, Pirro, Froyo, they study far-right movements and the linkages, but it is a missing link in understanding how policy evolves and changes. Another way to think about it is that a lot of people, of course, are aware of the importance of churches as global players in religiosity. But if you, and this is very important, but a lot of the advocacy that's done here on the ground is not done by churches. It's done by civic or uncivic groups that are advocating and mobilizing for certain outcomes. And so, for example, there's a Polish anthropologist, Starzyński, that argues, who actually goes to Polish churches and looks at the advocacy networks. And in his work, he reports that a lot of the Polish churches are actually quite uncomfortable with this activism, because in the long run, and some of the results that I'll show you indicate that for churches, this is, they play with fire, because a lot of people do not like meddling of churches into politics. So in a way, a lot of the policies can be hijacked by advocacy groups with extremist agendas that might not serve sort of the long-term objectives of the churches. And then another sort of theoretical basket of issues that one might consider is that the 1990s in Eastern Europe was a time of liberal civil groups, but now we have moved to the era of bad civil society, or as Michael Bernhard calls it, uncivil society. And these groups are collaborating, they're very successful, and they they have accomplished a lot in a very, very, very short period of time. So now let me very briefly walk you through some of the data that I gathered in these 4 countries. So that would be Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Poland. And so each of the countries, there's a different survey organization in each of the countries. And so I will very quickly walk you through some of a very simple results. And at the end, when sort of I do this, and hopefully you passed your eye test and you can distinguish between shades of gray, you are going to be confused, which is sort of the idea here. So, you know, at the end, you will realize that there are some similarities in these countries in the way that there is a strong support for what might call a traditional family, but you also realize that there are a lot of inconsistencies in some of these attitudes, and what's going to stand out are results from Poland. So that can mean 2 things. Either that the survey agency messed up, but I think the way to interpret results in Poland is that it is a case when there has been so much politicization of women's rights and LGBTQ rights that the tide is turning against sort of meddling and illiberal activism in Polish politics. So what these countries have in common is that there is something that we call majoritarianism in political science. So that means that most people in these countries think that the government should defend the rights of the titular nationality. So that be Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, or Slovaks. And this, of course, applies also when you ask about rights for immigrants. Surprise, surprise, in this country, most people think when jobs are scarce, of course, the jobs should go to natives and not to immigrants. Now, let's say things start getting sort of more interesting when you start thinking about women and families. And so women are not a minority, but there is a question that asks whether when jobs are scarce, men should have more rights to a job than a woman. And so there are 2 things that, stand out. First of all, there is a quite degree of variation in these countries, but the country where most people do not agree with the statement is Poland, which in general is more traditional than the Czech Republic, more conservative, more religious, but yet sort of this 11% again can mean that there's something wrong with the survey, or that sort of the recent experience with male politicians dominating sort of this whole agenda over human rights is losing its resonance. And sort of the similar results are, if you ask people whether men make better political leaders than women do. So in Slovakia and Hungary, half of the people think this is the case. And again, Poland stands out where only 17% people think that this is the case. Now, I will sort of shift gears and talk a little bit about attitudes towards abortion, traditional families, gay and right issues, and attitudes towards church meddling in politics. So, the only country that actually restricts abortion is Poland. I mean, Hungary is a complicated story, but in general, nobody really supports strict abortion. So that is quite unpopular. However, when you start thinking, and this is actually at the core of a lot of the debates about same-sex rights, both rights for LGBTQ families, where, as you will see in the survey, most people are absolutely willing to extend rights to the LGBTQ, but the sore point is the issue of children. Most people in Eastern Europe do not think that gay and lesbian couples should be able to adopt children. And they also don't think that let's say a lot of the gay and lesbian couples have their own biological children, but there is a lot of opposition to a policy where the partner can adopt the child of the other person. So in Eastern Europe, most people absolutely think that a child needs a home with both father and mother to grow up happily. And so it's about 74% in all of these countries. So it's a very, very traditional view of a family life. Most people also think that marriage should be only between a man and woman. So over 50% people think that, and again, there's a strong support in Hungary and Slovakia. So on the one hand, you have very strong support for very traditional families. Children should be with men and women. And then you ask, do you support same-sex rights for lesbians and gays? And most people think, yeah, it's a great idea. And this is actually quite consistent I mean, this was my own survey, but this is consistent with a lot of the surveys that have been done by other agencies. So in principle, it's a population that's absolutely open to it as long as you don't touch children. So the same in a way as schizophrenia applies to Christianity. And again, Poland stands quite apart in this survey. When you ask people, most of these are Christian countries, basically. I mean, there's the fundamental culture basis. So in Czechia and Poland, people do not think that children should learn basic Christian culture. In Slovakia and Hungary, this is more supported. But again, in Poland, when this was actually done, there is a very low support for basically teaching principles of Christianity in school. And when you ask people whether the church should play a bigger role in politics, Poland freaks out. Only 6% think this should be the case. So it's an absolute no-go. And actually, in most of these countries, people absolutely do not think that churches should play a big role in the politics. And the churches know it, and they really have to be very careful about what they do. And so now let me very quickly walk you through one or two endorsement experiments that were done in the countries. The way to think about an endorsement experiment is a situation when you ask a question about a group that's very sensitive and you would like to, and people don't want to give you a truthful answer, and you associate the group with a certain policy. So you associate, for example, this is a survey that asks about support for the Center for Fundamental Rights in Hungary, and you ask about the support endorsed by this group for marriage, abortion ban, and Christianity in school. And so what happens in this survey shows, if you look at the traditional marriage, so the second from the bottom, voters who did not vote for Fidesz, this graph shows a political alignment. So people who did not vote for Fidesz, they will reduce the endorsement in the domain of traditional marriage for the Center for Fund. So in a way, they align with the anti-policy against Fidesz. And then the Fidesz voters, when they are asked about support for this group, they will increase their support for abortion ban. So in a way, in Poland, you see an alignment when people fall in line with political directions, and the causal relationship between Fidesz and the Center for Fundamental Rights. This is very different in the Czech Republic. First of all, the Movement for Life is not so well known. This was actually a huge problem when we did the survey. We were not sure whether people know them very well. Luckily enough, they made some stupid comments right before the survey, so it's a little bit more salient. But on the top, you'll see that actually the experimental and the control groups do not differ much. But what happens is that once you split the groups by gender, you will see, in a way, an opposite effect. You will see that if women are asked for their support for the movement of life, and the movement of life is associated with traditional marriage, they absolutely they decrease their support for traditional marriage. So in a way, speaking about the movement of life and traditional marriage freaks you out as a woman, and you will decrease a support for this, for the group. So this means that sometimes the groups actually can achieve an opposite effect when people are so angry and so disgusted with some of these policies that the polarization goes in opposition, goes against the group. Poland has very interesting results. A lot of the results wash out in Poland because I think there are a lot of things happening at the same time. This is support for Ordo Iuris, and there are two things that stand out. Number one, Ordo Iuris polarizes women, but it seems that it polarizes conservative women because the endorsement increases support for traditional marriage for women, and it seems from these preliminary results that actually it increases opposition to abortion when it's linked to Ordo Iuris. So to conclude from this very quick presentation, mobilization of conservative civil society is one of the biggest and unexpected game changers. Social conservatism has a strong support, but it's very messy. And there are a lot of inconsistencies in these attitudes. And uncivil society can map into pre-existing cleavages and deepen discord in both directions. It can actually mobilize against all these sort of all these efforts to restrict rights. So it can trigger support for conservative organizations, but it can also contribute to an opposition to these groups. So that's sort of a hopeful finding.
Wow, so Poland's become Ireland, huh? So as Carlos said to everybody, this is based on the conclusion of an edited book, and it's co-authored by Carlos and I. Anything stupid that I say on Latin American politics has been based on my attempt to adapt what we thought to the themes of the conference, which are somewhat different from the themes of the book. I took some liberties in what we said in terms of trying to generalize and push our argument further. Please be kind to me on Latin America. Talk to Carlos afterwards and ask him to give me remedial training on Latin America. So, and I'm going to get global here. I'm going to be the only one to go global in the room, or fully global. I mean, a lot of people have talked about transnational networks and the like, and I'm also the only one who's not going to use a PowerPoint. So we're in a period of democratic backsliding globally. We see this both in newer and older established democracies. Sometimes the backsliding that we see means a reduction in the quality of democracy without authoritarian regime change, for instance, in the US, Brazil, Poland, the Philippines. And sometimes it amounts to a full breakdown of democracy that goes beyond backsliding and actually deteriorates into regime change. We've seen that in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Hungary, Tunisia, Turkey, for examples. And we also see a number of cases where democracy is still just hanging on: Senegal, India, Bosnia. The potential outcomes are highly indeterminate, despite these tendencies in the time that we live. A high percentage of these cases are also associated with populist leaders who are the executors of democratic deterioration, or sometimes things even worse. They are kind of the rogues gallery of our age: Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, Kaczynski. I could go on and on. There are even some cases where the emergence of leaders described as populists have not severely damaged democracy, or democracy has quickly recovered. Meloni, surprisingly, hasn't done much to undermine democracy in Italy. Johnson, for all his buffoonery, did not undermine democracy in the United Kingdom. There are some leaders who are populists on the left, I would argue, enhanced democracy, perhaps Tsipras in Greece or Lula in Brazil. And there are some leaders who just didn't have much effect because the quality of democracy was relatively low when they came in and was the same when they left. So Borisov in Bulgaria, or Babiš in Czechia didn't have any real lasting effect, it would seem. I would also argue that the association between backsliding and populism is no coincidence. There are a number of structural patterns globally that both promote the enfeeblement of democracy and abet the rise of populist leaders. The literature on regime change looks at these factors, as the kind of things that enhance the probabilities of democratic backsliding or breakdown. The literature on populism looks at these factors as the sorts of things that promote the failure of existing systems of representation in democratic regimes. And this abets the rise of populism. Populism is a failure of democracy, as a system of representation. So what are some of the structural patterns that we see globally that promote both of these things? We've talked a lot about neoliberal capitalism and how it creates increased inequality globally. But it actually, neoliberal capitalism has made the globe more equal because of the growth of middle classes in China and India. Yet within every country in the world, save one, I believe the Netherlands, there's been greater inequality. So it affects internal inequality in countries, while globally neoliberal capitalism has made the country made the globe more egalitarian because of the growth of wealth in China and India. For third and fourth wave countries democratizing in the third and fourth wave, democratizing under conditions of neoliberal capitalism has meant that capitalism was not accompanied by the rise of welfare states and welfare state protection, which means that this enhances the threat that inequality and economic deterioration has on democracy. But even in developed democracies that have relatively more advanced welfare state protections, we've seen the intensification of poverty in many places, or the reemergence of poverty in places where it was almost gone, particularly in Western Europe. In every country in the world, we're seeing the relative differences between rich and poor grow, and we see populations that were doing okay being pushed into poverty. This is one of the things that promotes both populism and the failure of democracy. Peak immigration has also been has had an effect. This has been stoked by severe crises around the world, in part caused by global climate change or other catastrophes such as war or state failure. Peak immigration leads to xenophobia and protection of national wealth. There's been the increased role of this new unequal wealth in politics. We've seen the reemergence of Gilded Age like plutocracy in many countries. And this enhances unresponsiveness to larger populations under democracy. We've also seen the eclipse of social democratic and labor movements and parties globally. There are tensions between economic bread and butter issues and postmodern demands like gender, ecological, and racial injustice issues in these political parties, and working class losses in response to the taking up of these new issues have not been offset by middle class gains. So the historical agent that has tried to defend populations against the deterioration of standards of living under democracy has been weakened. We also see fading memories of the costs of reaction in past eras. The passing of the World War II generation has meant that active memory of what totalitarianism meant in the middle of the last century has meant that historical knowledge about how dangerous these ideas are has stopped. So the same things that give rise to representation failure have also been historically associated with failing and failed democracies. Yet populism does not automatically mean the failure of democracy. Why so? Well, any failure of democracy probably will include a crisis of representation. However, a crisis of representation will not automatically lead to a failure of democracy. We can get realignments, we can get new movements emerging, and we can get the re-equilibration of democracy. Perhaps we can even get the improvement of the system of representation with the emergence of new political actors. I'm still waiting for that moment in the contemporary era, though. Furthermore, when we think about populism too, we have to remember that populism in its most common definition is defined as a thin ideology. And as a thin ideology, it can be associated with any number of reference. And then then populism itself can not only be an adjective, but it can be a noun. And so we need to be cognizant of when we use the word populism, what we're referring to, or whether we're referring to populism as a thing in itself. So populism can refer to movements, both Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party were so-called populist movements, as was the Brexit campaign or the Indignados in Spain. It can refer to parties. Some parties can be on the left, some can be on the right, but they can use the thin ideology of populism, which sets up this antinomy between the people and the corrupt elite. So Syriza in Greece, Lega Nord, Forza Italia, the Five Star Movement, País in Ecuador, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. I can go on and on. What to me is interesting about this list is that in terms of democracy, Right-wing populism seems slightly more dangerous, is considerably more dangerous for democracy than left-wing populism, but left-wing populism, as we know from, for instance, hearing Laura's presentation, also can pose a danger. We can also have populist governments. So we have recently re-elected populist governments in Serbia and Hungary. We have a newer populist government in Italy, and we'll perhaps see one in the Netherlands. We've also seen a number of populist governments fall in the last several years. Trump in the United States, Janša in Slovenia, the peace government just went down in Poland. And then we've also seen cases where populists have gone down, such as Fico in Slovakia, and then he gets re-elected in the last election in Slovakia. I hope that's not a portent for my own country, but we shall see. And ultimately, we can think of populism as a regime, as an institutionalized form of rule. So the Novo Estado in Brazil, Peronismo in Argentina, Fidesz in Hungary, the AKP in Turkey have all established authoritarian regimes. So here it's not an adjective that describes a political actor, but a thing in itself. The key question is not whether populism is here to stay, as long as there remain populations who feel disenfranchised, ineffectively represented by their existing democratic systems, populism will be an inherent possibility within democracy. With regard to the relationship between populists and backsliding, the key question is what populists do when they take power. When their definition of the people is exclusionary, substantive concerns predominate over procedural rules of democratic competition, accountability, and majority rule. This leads to attempts to undermine the formal institutional constraints and informal norms that, that constitute horizontal accountability in democracy. The undermining of horizontal accountability allows populists to undermine electoral integrity and allows them to circumvent the next round of periodic vertical accountability provided by elections. It also allows them to interfere in the autonomy of civil society and thus undermine the social accountability that civil society provides by doing things such as monitoring the state, protesting, and other forms of social resistance. This points us to three areas of resistance to democratic backsliding. So resistance can be concentrated in any one of three spheres, given this, through electoral contestation, through institutional resistance to aggrandizement of executive power within the institutions of the state, and by the imposition of costs on anti-democratic actors by contentious activity by civil society organizations and social movements. So it can be fought during elections, it can be fought within the state itself, particularly when there's division of power within the state, and by social actors who are opposed to the measures that populists or that inherent dictators want to take. Populist victories in elections and their accession to power often leads to a protracted struggle with non-populist parties, civil societies or organizations, and rule-governed national and supranational institutions. These kinds of struggles not only are not distinct, but often overlap. Resistance can be multidimensional, and within time, depending on what's going on, these dimensions can interact in important ways. So for instance, civil society mobilization, when combined with electioneering, can be very important in stopping populist threats to democracy. In episodes when populists try to undermine democratic norms and rules, creates periods of regime uncertainty where regimes hover or teeter between diminished democracy and authoritarianism. Quite often, the dividing line is very blurry. The former is backsliding, of course. This kind of period is a form of extreme backsliding. This kind of regime indeterminacy, where the struggle over what happens next is going on. When populists finally sort of undermine enough conditions, then we can begin to talk about democratic breakdown. Prospects for slow authoritarianization are diminished by situations of divided government, where the opponents of populist executive aggrandizement have the means to block authoritarian populist measures. Where there's unified majoritarian government, or even worse, constitutional majoritarianism, the prospects of backsliding and breakdown are enhanced. The difference between Orban's institutionalization of an authoritarian regime and the ability of the polls to overturn peace through elections shows how critical this is. This has a definitive impact on how populism comes to be institutionalized systematically in our age. I believe we can see it institutionalized in three ways. It can become embedded in the party system. It can be tamed by power, and it can institutionalize as authoritarian rule. So, embedding in party systems. One way in which populism becomes durable is embedding itself in the party system. In many places, established party systems have collapsed. One existing example of this is, for instance, France, where the long-established political parties, the conservatives, the Gaullists, the socialists, the communists have all withered away. And the system is now facing largely two very important parties, or two parties which have presidential possibility, which is the party of the novel centrist Emmanuel Macron and the party of Marine Le Pen. Macron defends formal democracy and has control of the executive and the legislature presently. The question is, what will happen if Le Pen wins the presidency, and whether her party controls the National Assembly there if she does win. The semi-presidential system in France has provision for cohabitation and executive diarchy that would be prejudicial to populist backsliding in the case of divided government. Unified government, however, would increase the danger of backsliding or even breakdown. But essentially what we have in France now electorally is a contest between populist and non-populist actors. Another example would be Argentina, where the legacy of Peronism is not one of regime continuity, but embeddedness in the party system. We see a large number of currents in Argentine politics claiming to represent the true Peronist lineage. Steve Levitsky should have also written an article about Peronism with adjectives. We have neo-Peronism, orthodox Peronism, revolutionary Peronism, renovation Peronism, Meninism, federal Peronism, and Kirchnerism. And finally, the long-established US party system is locked into a permanent two-party alternation due to its plurality electoral system and a series of institutional compromises struck between the two parties to institutionalize themselves in the system. Recently, the Republican Party has been subject to a hostile takeover by the Trump faction and its radicalized base. The US is now locked into a pattern where it seems inevitable that we will have periods of right populist rule that alternate with a non-populist alternative, and periods of power sharing between populists and non-populists in situations of divided government, like we actually have at this very moment. This is exacerbated by the winner-take-all nature of US presidential elections and the remnants of 19th century US constitutional structure that make it difficult. Remnants of 19th century US constitutional structure in which the citizens of small states are overrepresented in the Senate, where the Senate has a very strong ability to disrupt the business of government, where state legislatures have the ability to gerrymander their own representation as well as that in the US Congress, and where states use where states in the United States use the power to control the franchise to continue to disenfranchise groups that have historically been disenfranchised and would vote for their opposition. We have a situation now where the Republican Party can take control in the United States by winning a minority of votes. where the Democratic Party needs to win more than a simple majority of 50% plus one, but needs to win 54 or 55%, for instance, to control the Congress because of gerrymandering, because of interference with voting, et cetera. And it's a question of whether we actually have what we could call a fully functional electoral democracy in the United States anymore. What we may have is democratic rule by one party and competitive authoritarian rule by another, which alternates back and forth. And we have to face the prospect that even without Trump coming in and being a dictator on day one, that we have a permanent change in the way we're ruled in the United States, that we can no longer with pride talk of ourselves as a country with a more than 200-year history of democracy, even though that is kind of a myth given the existence of chattel slavery and other forms of disenchantment in our country. We can also talk about the taming of populism by existing democratic system. So the collapse and remaking of the Italian party system in the 1990s anticipated what has occurred in France. It went further in that populist parties have already participated in coalition governments or led them. Italy has 4 different competing populist parties: the Five Star Movement, Meloni's Brothers of Italy, Salvini's Lega, and the coalition and the late Berlusconi's Forza Italia. The latter 3 sit in a government, and yet they aren't able really to transact wide-ranging sort of populist politics because they don't trust each other, and the coalition nature of government actually works as a sort of break on what any one of them would do if they had a majority government. In Sweden, the right populist Sweden Democrats supported the government of moderate party leader Ulf Kristersson without having ministerial portfolios. So they supported the government, but they don't sit in it. They did, however, receive chairmanships in the Swedish legislature for the first time, 4 of them. The SDs have influence on the government and its policies without sitting in it. Without their vote of confidence, the government could have not been formed. This could be the first steps in normalizing the party platform and incorporating it into the Swedish multi-party system. And the fact that it is a multi-party system means that the populists will have a hard time implementing their program, and it could normalize them in their program into the Swedish system. Similarly, the pluralist victory of Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom in the last Dutch elections and his attempts to form a ruling coalition has forced him to back off some of the most controversial planks of his party program, like banning mosques, veils, or the Quran. There's still no government, but this shows that the possibility of the prospect of holding power may force populists to mitigate some of their most outrageous planned actions. I finally want to turn to authoritarian institutionalization. Most recently, in an international context where it was thought to be difficult to get away with coups d'etat, populists such as Chavez, Erdogan, Orban have slowly undermined democracy from within, leading to situations where the continuity of democratic rule became ambiguous, under threat, and eventually ended. In these situations, undivided government with unassailable majorities implemented programs that dismantled democracy from within by undermining checks and balances, electoral fairness, freedom of the press, and civil society autonomy. In contrast, we also do see some desperate attempts at putches by populist would-be autocrats. Perhaps we need to consider the possibility that the age of coup reticence, or perhaps maybe we're in a new age of potential putches, which are more civilian in nature, is over in the face of attempts by Donald Trump and Bolsonaro to overturn elections that they lost. This seems more common occurrence or possible in winner-take-all situations where aspiring dictators lose elections rather than in multi-party coalition governments. The case of Hungary perhaps gives us the best example of what an institutionalized populist regime in the current age might look like. The basic architecture of Hungary's previous liberal democracy has been undermined by the disassembly of mechanisms of vertical, horizontal, and social accountability. This became possible when Fidesz won a supermajority in an election and had the ability to change the Constitution at will. This is the real danger with populists, the winning of single party government, and even worse, a single party government with a constitutional majority. So Fidesz has used this power to rewrite the Constitution. It's moved the basic architecture of the regime from democratic to competitive authoritarian. The electoral system has been manipulated to assure Fidesz constitutional majorities in the legislature. The media has effectively been monopolized by a combination of control of state media and Fidesz aligned oligarchs buying up all the private media. And this makes it difficult for electoral opponents of the regime to get their message out. So elections may be free in Hungary, but they're certainly not fair. Horizontal checks and balances have undermined by the capture of the legal system by the regime, taking over the judges, the prosecutor general, the stacking of regulatory bodies by Fidesz appointees, and the creation of a special form of legislation, so-called cardinal acts, which can only be repealed by a 2/3 vote, basically leaving Fidesz's legal system intact, even if they lose an election. They've also increased state encroachment into the public sphere with the politicization of higher education and culture, the remaking of school curriculum, the politicization of museums, so on and so forth. The ultimate takeaway, perfect, of our investigation has been that populism shows little sign of abating. We need to keep in mind that its origins are to be found in the failure of existing systems of rule to effectively represent their populations. It's a failure of democracy. This is particularly acute for democracies in our present age, when the privileges of the rich and powerful have shut out the grievances of extensive groups of citizens, where decision-making in many areas has been turned over to technocrats with the requisite expertise, and substantial external shocks such as recessions, financial crises, wars, and natural disasters have disrupted existing social orders. Populists are constrained by domestic institutions and global interdependence, and not all who attempt to undermine the institutional fabric of democracy are successful. But alas, similar to Bolsonaro and Trump, they can provoke and exacerbate crises and further delegitimize democracy as a system of rule. The crucial question for democracies today is whether populists can think of democracy as a system in which losing power and competing in the next round is preferable to overthrowing it and staying in power by non-democratic means. On this question, the record of populism is decidedly mixed and the fate of democracy uncertain. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let's have questions, comments. Should we get a couple of questions first? Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. This was really great, and I'm actually really eager to talk to several of you after this. But to keep things short, I just have one question for Michael, and this is going to be me channeling my inner Jan Kubik, because I can hear his voice asking this question, which is, so about what the role, when you talked about how sort of broad this concept of populism and populist is, you know, I've always sort of been under the understanding and assumption that the rule of law is and sort of crossing that line of the rule of law is fundamental to that, which is why when you think about, or at least for me, when I think about Bernie Sanders or Lula of Brazil, I won't consider populist, because the intention was not to, there was no indication that they were going to use the democratic system against itself for undemocratic means, right? So I would say sort of the same thing. I was curious as to why you would think Occupy Wall Street would be populist beyond just the rhetoric of the people versus the elite. So I just wanted to see your thoughts on that.
Let's gather two questions.
Hello. Well, thank you very much for a great, very inspiring panel to finish a great conference. And I had a couple of questions for two participants. I was very interested in the remark, if I understood correctly, of Professor Buštíková on the importance of looking at civil society and civil society, and that there is more emphasis on looking at executives and perhaps masses, but not so much at the intermediate level. So one thing would be like maybe expand a little bit more. And for Professor Sharon Austin, well, first, thank you for all you do for the rest of Floridians like myself. And I also like to be a little bit more optimistic at the end of the conference. I was interested on if you can expand a little bit on the different levels of resistance, like in the judicial system, unions, but also like in most of the conference, religious groups have appeared like at the basis of all this regression, but for instance, in terms of resistance to these conservative policies in Florida and other places, there are also movements like that I heard of in the radio, but by churches organizing to teach critical race theory as an extracurricular activity, because African-American children are not going to be taught about their history in schools. So if you could expand a little bit more on, if we can learn a little bit more about the uncivil and the civil societies that are resisting these movements.
So I'm just using Kaltwasser and Mude, the very minimalist definition. There is a kind of debate in the literature on populism that sometimes populism is good for democracy. Sometimes, so for instance, there's the idea that disenfranchised populations are actually brought into the, or are enfranchised by populist parties. There's also, the question that sometimes there is representation failure by the existing parties in a populist challenge can cause them to clean up their game and really get serious about representing the people who they purport to represent. So I don't necessarily think that populism is inherently anti-democratic. However, I certainly think nativist right-wing populism is highly dangerous. I also think that certain forms of left populism that get out of control also are dangerous for democracy, but some populist movements are actually have a salutary effect for democracy, either by incorporation or by forcing the system to reform itself. So.
All right, I can go ahead and go next. You were asking about the various types of resistance and efforts to preserve democracy, and I was just taking some notes. I think when it comes to religion and when it comes to churches, as far as the attacks on the theories that I mentioned and the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm not seeing a lot of activism on the part of churches. I think some of the more conservative churches are in favor of the things that are happening. But I think that there are some churches that are sponsoring for books that are being banned. They're sponsoring teach-ins and allowing and even basically giving out some of the books that are being banned. And I think that's their way of showing that they're in support of protecting democracy and academic freedom. In terms of the courts, with some of the court challenges to some of the laws that I mentioned, for the most part, we've been successful at the district court level. But once they reach the appellate courts, that court system is a lot more conservative, and some of those cases are overturned. And I've noticed that not only with my work in terms of academic freedom, but also in some of the work that I've done as an expert witness, we'll get a victory at the district court level, but then on appeal, it'll be overturned sometimes. So with courts, you just never know. In terms of other types of activism that I've seen and sort of as a way to fight the types of things that are happening in states, especially here in Florida, we have a very strong union that has grown tremendously. I think even with some of the different, with the one particular law against the UFF, the United Faculty of Florida, that says that they could no longer collect their donations from our paychecks. We had to pay them separately and electronically. But as a result of that, the union now has a growth of over 60%. So there's been a lot of growth in the union even over the last few months. So as far as the civil rights groups like the ACLU, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, the League of Women Voters, and other groups, they have been very active in protecting, I guess, democracy and supporting the different lawsuits and finding plaintiffs who are willing to speak out. But as far as the faculty and also especially as far as the administration, I think there's a lot of fear on the part of faculty, especially on the part of people who are untenured. They would like to do more. They'd like to say more. I even have talked to people who told me that I would have liked to have gotten involved, but I'm untenured or, I don't have a tenure track position. And so they maybe are doing things behind the scenes. They're joining the union, but they don't want to put themselves out there for reasons that are pretty obvious. They're afraid of retaliation. And then as far as the administration, I think we have a situation where people are just trying to, I guess, protect their jobs, and they aren't really vocally, at least maybe you may not agree with me on this, people who are here at the University of Florida, but I haven't really seen a lot of administrators really speaking out against the different pieces of legislation. And I think the reason is pretty obvious. They're afraid that, there's a lot of retaliation, and they're afraid that if they speak out that, they might be removed from their positions. So I'm seeing a lot of resistance, but I'm also seeing a lot of backlash.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I just want to say Michael wrote an article in which he sort of talks about the evolution of civil society in Eastern Europe, and sort of it progresses from insurgent to good old days of institutionalized. It's the Soros era. And then now we are in an era of a struggle between uncivil or illiberal civil society and firewall civil society. And I'm absolutely convinced this is a big missing piece in the literature on backsliding. The uncivil groups do a lot of things. So if you want to understand the rise of Orban, you should read about how he captured middle class and upper middle class Christian groups and his rise to power. Absolutely important. Very often these groups, are vote rich, so they serve mobilization. But sometimes we also see a lot of learning. So for example, there are prayers in parliament, something that didn't happen before. I'm absolutely convinced, I'm actually trying to figure out that this was imported from the United States. There is a lot of money and funding that comes from the United States and from Russia to support these groups, so in a way they took the Soros playbook and flipped it upside down. And very often I think these, so for example, in the Czech case, you see there are a lot of legal documents and legal opinions on gender ideology that these groups share, and they really, when it comes to writing clause or regulatory framework, they're extremely effective. So for example, in the Czech case, we got access to the emails of the senators, and it's like the Ordo Juris, it's translated into Czech and it's very good. But some of the chain emails, it's obvious that the original language was either Polish or Russian. So I think there is a sort of a global conspiracy, but also a lot of activism that really comes from the bottom up. Like in the Czech case, this was really an innocent parent group that has grown in importance beyond belief. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you for all the panelists. My question is for Sharon. I am from Manatee County, where New College of Florida is located. Sister county with Moms for Liberty, which has had a huge impact on the K-12 schools. We have seen Richard Corcoran's action in our counties when back then was the Commissioner of Education, way before he was appointed new president at the New College of Florida. I have personally seen a local middle school take over Title I school that serve majority Black and brown students. So coming to my question is, I've seen all that impact on the K through 12 level. And now you can show all of the damage that it caused to higher education. So my question is, are you already seeing the results of new incoming students that have already suffered the ban from the last 2 years of high school, that have the programs cut off, like that they are not allowed to have the African American studies at their local high school? And even though I know there are organizations and local churches that are presenting those materials, there are a lot of those of our students that are not able to get to those programs or don't have the access to those programs, especially Manatee County. We have a huge migrant population. So now you have a language barrier. So you might have local churches, but you might have a language barrier with the family. So what is the level that you're seeing now in your department, let's say, or even other departments, of income students that are not benefiting from, that didn't benefit from the last even 2 years of high school? And what do you see then in the future in the higher education level of them not having those programs starting from, kindergarten? Thank you.
Hi, this is a question from Miles, and this is a real question because it's from my ignorance of the region. So how do you define populism, and what do you think is the difference between like 70s nationalism and 21st century, as you called it, like nationalist, like resource populism? Are there any obvious differences between the two? And just another question for Sharon. If when I talk to my mother, I mean, I live in the United States, so I know what it's at stake. But when I talk to my mother who lives in Mexico and says like, but why is it so bad if they say that they are against racism? Or like if the laws, like what the laws say is that they should not teach that they are intrinsically superior groups. And I said, like, I'm horrified, mommy, they have these horrible people. It's like, well, but they say that they shouldn't teach that they are superior groups. So how does one navigate the legal challenge when the laws have been written in such a way that they seem to favor them as the non-racist? How does one do that? Or how would you explain it? How do you explain it in the courts, and how would you explain it to my mother?
Thank you all for the great panel. My question is for Professor Buštíková. It was great to listen to you, and I would have many questions, but I will focus on one. You mentioned majoritarianism, right? And this is something that we see in Latin America as well, including when networks that involve Ordo Iuris and other organizations are concerned. But when you showed the opinion data that you have, we see that it's much more nuanced, right? So they kind of play the card of majoritarianism, and I'm pretty convinced of that in the case of some countries in South America. So, for example, abortion, they do not have a majoritarian opinion against abortion, supporting the ban of abortion rights in Poland, for example. So, do you think that these uncivil society organizations are being able to kind of create an idea of a majoritarian opinion trend? Are they like being loud enough and effective enough to be heard by, for example, Congress members, as you mentioned now? And is that what is happening? Just because we have these different levels, and I think we still don't know very well how they connect to each other. Thank you.
Hi, I just want to say thank you. I've learned a lot from each presentation. So I kind of wanted to ask more of a general question in the sense that on a local basis, the University of Florida is dealing with a lot of the issues that Sharon Austin specifically stated, but also the removal of DEI initiatives. So where does what is happening with Florida and the United States as a whole leave us on the global stage? And what precedent does this set as we continue to experience democratic backsliding globally, but also on the future and for generations to come?
Thank you for the question. The answer is loosely. It's how I define populism, as you can tell. And I think my focus, drawing on the cloud, but trying to apply it to very different African context is, the context, one of the reasons I provocatively try and bring 1970s into conversation with 1990s is these are really different periods. We have a pronounced one-party state authoritarian regimes in almost all African countries in the 1970s. The 1990s is the kind of high point of competitive, formal multi-partyism. But what I would argue is the common characteristics is something which is identifiable globally, but also has a specific African formation, is leaders who appeal to an invoked people over the heads and in some ways against institutional political structures, drawing on appeals or invoking appeals to a kind of essentialist idea of cultural belonging and ahistorical kind of characterization of cultural belonging, which in Africa often involves a kind of idealized pre-colonial patriarchal set of ideas, and anti-elitist in the sense of critiquing educated as technocratic elites as unpatriotic, as representing foreign interests, and counterposing those to a sort of idealized view of the people. So lots of things there that would chime with characterizations of populism elsewhere, but there is a very specific kind of African version of that. And to be clear, most people who've written about the 1970s in Africa don't talk about populism, but as a historian, I'm interested in seeing this kind of common pattern of a authoritarian populist nationalism that counterposes itself to technocratic good governance, as I was explaining earlier.
Yeah, thank you for this question. So we can either spend 3 hours on this or 3 minutes, but it's a wonderful question. And I will say 2 things: ethnicity and children. So I think as you absolutely sort of noticed, the idea of majoritarianism is developed around the idea that the divisions are around ethnicities or races, and that is changing quite rapidly. And a lot of the new contestation is really around the issue of sexual autonomy and gender autonomy. I'm absolutely convinced that this is not about LGBTQ people, but it is about LGBTQ people being able to raise children. Because all of this, when you think about pedophilia laws or Hungary, or the biggest, especially these public opinion surveys show you that in general, people are not opposed to, actually there's quite a high degree of tolerance for LGBTQ people, as long as they don't want to touch kids, even their own kids or adopt kids. And so I think the new majoritarianism is this emphasis on traditional family with a man and woman raising a child. And that's why you also see in the domain of social policies, there's a lot of emphasis on child allowances, supporting middle-class families. And what I didn't mention actually in 2 of these cases, these allowance for family, they're, Ordo Juris, that's a beast and the center. But these 2 in the Czech and Slovakia, their purpose is to give, if women get pregnant, what they do is that they ask them to keep the child, they give them money, they help them through the process. And so that was the original idea of the organization: do not abort, we will help you. Now there are some stipulations. You cannot have a lot of children because you can be a Roma woman, so they select carefully whom they save. But fundamentally, this is behind the whole idea. So I think this is really about raising kids, not LGBTQ. It's very simplified, but yeah. But again, then there is a 3-hour conversation after this.
All right, in the interest of time, I think I can kind of address all three questions just through one statement. So the first question was about the impact that I've seen. I've been on sabbatical this year, so I wasn't teaching, but over the last couple of years, I have seen, and Michael, you may want to chime in on this, but in terms of recruiting, I've noticed that even with some of the positions that we've had in our department that would have been easily fillable, people have turned them down, and it may be because of reasons that have nothing to do with the idea that some of the people that we've interviewed expressed that they were concerned about their ability to talk about race in their classes because of some of these laws. And so, Florida has a bad reputation, I think, because our governor is such a high-profile person, and because he was on the national stage running for president, I think that that has encouraged people to not want to come here. And even I think that some people even have left. I know, especially some of the African-American faculty that I know, there've never been very many of us here, but even the few that I know over the last couple of years, I know of 3 people who've left. And with all 3 of them, they each said that they left because they felt that they couldn't teach the same way that they could when they first came here. And then also another thing in terms of the impact, and the third question asked about our reputation on the global stage. The support systems are lacking. If you remove the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, if you alienate faculty who teach the kind of courses that I teach, that deal with race and ethnicity, that many of us teach, that deal with gender, sexual orientation, if you alienate those faculty, you're doing a disservice to the entire campus, not just to the students who are members of those groups, but to all the students, because you're depriving them of the expertise and the type of diversity that we bring. And so that has to have a negative impact on our reputation on a global stage. And in terms of the second question, the one thing that I've noticed in looking at these different laws, not just here, but throughout the nation, is the way that they are worded in such a way that you would think that, it sounds good if you say that you can't teach something to insinuate that one group is superior to another. Well, of course, that's something we all agree with, but it affects people like me. If I'm teaching an African-American politics class and we're talking about Jim Crow, or we're talking about the legacy of slavery, with the way that the vague language that's being included in some of these laws, I might be accused of having said something inappropriate simply because I talked about something and I didn't bring in the kind of viewpoint diversity. And even if you just have one student that doesn't agree with what you have to say, that you're at risk. And so as a tenured professor who is a full professor, I can say no to this. I can rebel against this. But if someone is a recent PhD that's an untenured faculty member, is teaching a class, and I even have had people in that position reach out to me and ask me, okay, how should I change this class? I'm planning to teach this class. Should I take this out? Should I use a different book? Should I teach the class in a different way from what I taught before? And so a lot of them are choosing to just not talk about certain issues at all because they're afraid of the risks that they might be taking. So I think that that's something that you might want to say to your mother, that it sounds good, it sounds fair, it sounds like something we would all agree with. But if you really look at the impact of saying that you can't talk about critical race theory, I use articles in my classes that use that as a framework, and they also provoke a really good discussion because a lot of students don't agree with it, and that's good because they say, oh, I don't think that this is right, or I don't think that America is based on white supremacy. And that's a good thing because it brings about a good debate. It's not about indoctrination. It's about just getting students to think critically. So I think that's the problem with the way these pieces of legislation are worded. The language is really vague and you really don't know if you're doing something wrong.
Is it on? Yeah. You hit the nail on the head. The way that's written is insidious. And the real kicker is the one where you can't make someone uncomfortable with what you're saying in the classroom, which effectively means that the grandchild of the slave could get fired for telling the grandchild of a slaveholder about slavery. And to me, that's the kind of rhetoric you have to use to refute it. I mean, it's insidious. And there is this notion that, somehow they're saying, that when these people also invoke Martin Luther King, I mean, it's ludicrous, but the rhetoric back has to expose it. Otherwise, people get somewhat confused by it, like your mother did.
Well, let me say something about this. I think that this country, the United States, is becoming more like Latin America, where where we have had laws that are impossible to follow. So in Latin America, most people make a living in the informal sector. So they don't have permits to sell, they don't have permits to build their own houses, they live in illegality. So in this country, they create a sense of anomia where they are provoking self-censorship and fear. My optimistic reading and saying to all of you is that we are not doing anything wrong. We will continue to do whatever we have been doing, and that we have a very strong and effective union. And we're going to continue to do what we work hard to do, to make our students think critically and learn different perspectives, to be very critical about society. And with those words of wisdom, I want to thank all of you for being here, all of the panelists that came for this fantastic conference. It has been a really great environment and experience. So thanks to all of you and to the public that has been with us these 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. As you leave, if you will please take